morning and welcome to Rising. We've got an excellent show for you today, jam-packed with terrific guests who are going to help us process what we have seen over the last few days as this increasingly becomes a Trump massive landslide victory for the Republicans.
A massive landslide, and we'll look into all sorts of aspects of that. And we've actually had some degree of sleep this time, so we should be in even finer spirits. So that's a good thing. So listen, let's get going. Robby, what's on your radar?
Happy to tell you. Now, the sheer impressiveness of Donald Trump's Election Day victory continues to grow, with the former president winning not just all the swing states, but the popular vote, the Senate. It's looking like maybe the House of Representatives as well. That's a lot. Trump will also exercise much greater control over his party than he did previously. The dissenters are gone. Make no mistake, this is an utter rout for the Democratic Party, one that will clear the way for the implementation of GOP policy goals on a scale hitherto undreamt of, at least since 2004. Democratic officials and pundits know that this is bad, though not all of them are willing to admit that the main fault lies with their candidate, Vice President Kamala Harris. If she does not deserve all the blame, it's only because she shares it with President Joe Biden, whose stubborn decision to seek re-election despite his advanced age and declining cognitive abilities compromised both of their candidacies. Now, various commentators have lashed out, not at Harris, but at you and me, at the American people. MSNBC's Joy Reid, for instance, maintained that Harris's campaign was historic and, quote, flawlessly run because Queen Latifah endorsed her. Seriously, let's watch.
This really was an historic, flawlessly run campaign. Queen Latifah never endorses anyone. She came out and endorsed. She had every prominent celebrity voice. She had the Taylor Swift to the Swifties. She had the Beehive. You could not have run a better campaign in that short period of time. And I think that's still true.
With Queen Latifah and the Swifties, how could she lose? Kamala Harris did not fail the American people. The voters failed Kamala Harris. They also failed Queen Latifah, I suppose. The explanation that Harris lost because the voters are too racist to accept her will always have a certain amount of appeal among the progressive pundit class. Of course, this theory runs into obvious trouble. Harris seemingly lost ground with virtually every demographic, including Black and Latino voters. Now, as for the argument that the electorate is biased against women candidates, look, there may be some underlying truth to that. I don't deny that some level of racism and sexism does exist in all corners of the world. It would be strange if it didn't exist in America as well. But it's important to note that Harris lost even more spectacularly than Hillary Clinton. Did the voters become a lot more sexist in the last couple of years? That's not entirely persuasive to me. Maybe there is something else going on. So what is that other thing? Now, the explanation likely to receive star billing from progressives is an increasingly familiar one: social media misinformation. MSNBC host Jen Psaki cited the dangers of disinformation and propaganda on X, the site run by ardent Trump backer and advisor and billionaire Elon Musk, as a reason to fear Musk's influence over Trump. Earlier in the week, before she knew Harris would lose, Psaki advised Democrats to take action against social media companies in order to limit the lies that they can spread. The host of The View sounded a similar note on their post-election episode.
It would help if we could regulate social media, because one of the biggest offenders is D.C. and Congress have not been able to do one thing in regard to the rogue corporations of social media.
It would help if we could regulate social media, said Sarah Haynes. D.C. and Congress have not been able to do one thing in regard to the rogue corporations of social media. Now, it's true, of course it's true, that outright lies and conspiracy theories flourish on social media, though one can also consume bad information on television, on the radio, in print, in books, and during in-person conversation. Prestigious journalistic institutions make serious errors. For instance, more than 4 years later, Politico has not corrected a flagrantly misleading headline: Hunter Biden's story is Russian disinfo, dozens of former intelligence officials say. You may have heard me bring this one up before. The laptop is not disinformation, and moreover, the intelligence officials did not claim that it was. They said it resembled Russian disinformation. Critics of the establishment progressive worldview, like myself, often call attention to the Hunter Biden laptop story because it is both a prominent example of the Democrats, national security experts, and media elites getting something wrong, and a prominent example of the concept of disinformation being wielded in bad faith. Civil libertarians are right to fear that the increasingly desperate calls to criminalize false information online or otherwise punish the platforms for not policing it effectively will result in the censorship of legitimate speech. It already has. The fact-checkers, disinformation watchdog organizations, and government agents have not proven themselves to be very adept at all at identifying actual disinfo. Calls from cable news pundits for government to do something to regulate social media more aggressively should be recognized as self-serving. Traditional media institutions recognize and resent that social media platforms are a boon to alternative, contrarian, libertarian perspectives. They allow independent writers, thinkers, and commentators to reach audiences without relying on legacy organizations. It's important to recognize that heavy-handed regulation of social media, something proposed by just as many Republicans and Democrats, by the way, would not merely reduce online misinformation, it would destroy the independent media ecosystem entirely. Provisions like Section 230, which protects social media companies from liability for user-generated content, allow the internet to function the way it does. Now, I say that's a good thing for the platforms, it's a good thing for free speech, and it's a good thing for contrarian perspectives. It's a bad thing for traditional media gatekeepers, and they know it. It's also striking to me that Democrats and media figures do not hesitate to denounce Trump's brazen and authoritarian tendencies, but fail to recognize that threatening, intimidating, and regulating social media companies until they agree to crack down on disfavored speech is itself an authoritarian action. Now, if Democrats really think they can't beat Trump unless they gut online speech protections, surveil social media companies, and deal a blow to the First Amendment, well, they should get used to the authoritarian moniker because that's how I'm going to describe them.
So listen, a lot of thoughts there, Robby.
I know, I'm in a spicy mood.
Yeah,
Hit me, Niall.
and I have some points that I agree with and some I disagree with, as usual.
Well, that's why we love you.
Exactly. I think that in relation to the Harris thing and like, oh, how could someone lose because Queen Latifah endorsed them, is just like a manifestly ludicrous thing to say. And I think there is this tendency in liberal media quarters to just find excuses that overlook the obvious and find all sorts of nefarious reasons as things that influence the media. I think that you and I have a principled disagreement on the topic of pushing back against whatever you want to call it, misinformation, which you think of as repressive and I think of as healthy in some ways. And the issue really, it gets down to whether, in Elon Musk's case, for example, you have a man who has personally spent more than $100 million in support of a particular candidate who is also the literal owner of a major channel where people now get their information. Now, that doesn't mean that everything he puts out is false, but it does, I think, call into question this idea that he's simply providing a neutral platform upon which people express their views.
I do hear that, and I wish that he did not try, I've said this before, try to be both the referee and the coach of a player or the coach of one of the sides. It is striking to me how much whining and complaining there was for conservatives about Mark Zuckerberg's much less overt favoring of Democrats. And of course, Mark Zuckerberg ended up making an enemy, even more powerful enemy of Democrats for what reasons that I think are utterly not fair to him at all. But still on Elon's site, you can fact check. Look, I think obviously responding to and trying to correct actually false information is a good idea and is the job of journalists and is the job of features on social media platforms like Community Notes, which I love. I just don't think it should be done, and I don't think you really disagree with this, that we ought to be really careful if that's being done at the level of government and being done at the level of suppression. I think it should be left to actually the professionals, the journalists, who do get things wrong, as we point out all the time, and then they have other people checking them. One great community, I think this is the right place, I wanted to note it, great community note I saw yesterday from, that Alan Lichtman guy?
Yeah.
So that's the guy with
keys.
With the keys to determine who's going to win. And we actually had him on for an interview a couple weeks ago, and he just tore into Nate Silver. He has this feud with Nate Silver.
That's right, yeah.
Nate Silver, whose models are just much more accurate than Alan Lichtman's random guess, and he had so Alan Lichtman wrote on X. Unlike Nate Silver, who will try to squirm out of why he didn't see the election coming, I admit I was wrong. there's a community note immediately that goes, Nate Silver's model predicted a 50-50 possibility of Harris or Trump winning, and he wrote a piece in the New York Times 2 weeks ago saying he thought Trump would win.
That's great. I probably shouldn't give our viewers behind the curtain thing insights into the Hill.com print side, but we wanted to headline a piece on that forecaster on forecaster violence, which I wish we had done, but we thought better of it. Excellent. Look, I do think that the community notes thing can be useful. I just think that to me, there's a big separation between people genuinely expressing a view, even if that is a heterodox view or an independent view or an unpopular view, and people putting actual fake news in the sense of news that has been confected or invented. Mm-hmm. There was a suggestion this campaign of a purportedly Russian misinformation thing where they had a clip of a purportedly Haitian man who was claiming he had voted in multiple locations, and it was literally false. Like, it wasn't like a debatable point. It was like something that had been invented. I think in a situation where so many people get their news from social media, you have to figure out what is the appropriate thing to do about that kind of stuff without repressing people's right to free speech.
Well, we've got a lot more today on the show about the role of non-traditional media and podcasts in boosting Donald Trump, which he took full advantage of. Actually, Barron Trump, his son, was involved in the efforts to get him on with Theo Vaughn and all sorts of other people. Very interesting. We have John Krakauer on the show to talk about that. More Rising right after this.
While I concede this election, I do not concede the fight that fueled this campaign.
That was, of course, Vice President Kamala Harris giving her concession speech Wednesday. She spoke from her alma mater, Howard University in Washington, D.C., and that, of course, was where she had planned to give her victory speech. Let's listen.
To the young people who are watching, it is... I love you, guys. To the young people who are watching, it is okay to feel sad and disappointed, but please know it's going to be okay. On the campaign, I would often say, when we fight, we win. But here's the thing. Sometimes the fight takes a while. That doesn't mean we won't win. That doesn't mean we won't win. The important thing is don't ever give up. Don't ever give up. Don't ever stop trying to make the world a better place. You have power. You have power. And don't you ever listen when anyone tells you something is impossible because it has never been done before.
So that was Harris's message of perseverance, emphasizing again and again, as you heard, that her supporters should not give up.
Harris called President-elect Donald Trump on Wednesday, officially conceding and congratulating him for winning the race. According to reports, she also talked about the importance of a peaceful transition of power. Nonetheless, reactions over her loss continue. Comedian Jimmy Kimmel held back tears in his opening monologue on Wednesday night. Let's watch that.
Let's be honest, it was a terrible night last night. It was a terrible night for women, for children, for the hundreds of thousands of hardworking immigrants who make this country go, for healthcare, for our climate, for science, for journalism, for justice, for free speech. It was a terrible night for poor people, for the middle class, for seniors who rely on Social Security, for our allies in Ukraine, for NATO, for the truth and democracy and decency. And it was a terrible night for everyone who voted against him. And guess what? It was a bad night for everyone who voted for him, too. You just don't realize it yet.
Jimmy Fallon, also host of a late-night talk show, weighed in as well. Take a look.
Democrats, today they turned to Elon Musk like, so tell me more about living on Mars. How close are we? You know, the election wasn't really close. It was a big night for Donald Trump and a bigger night for Don Julio. That's right, 51% of the country is really happy, 47% are really hungover, and one guy is both. And, you know, Trump won last night in pretty convincing fashion, securing the Electoral College and the popular vote, which means for the first time ever, he'll accept the results of an election.
And of course, there was The View's co-host Whoopi Goldberg reacting. Let's watch that.
Think about this. She did this in 2 months.
Yeah, no.
She did this in 2 months.
She left it all on the
You know,
yes, she
look,
did.
she, you know, everybody can always say, oh, she should have done this, she should have done this, She did what she did. She was everywhere. She talked to everybody, and people didn't come out. I don't know why, and it doesn't even matter. He's now the president. I'm still not going to say his name. That's not going to change.
So look, it's a tough job to have to go up there after, losing a close election, losing a not so close election, as this ended up being not so close, but still, I'm sure, devastating for her to lose, just as it was devastating to Trump last time, and it was devastating to Hillary Clinton. It was really devastating for Hillary Clinton because she actually absolutely expected to win, whereas I think Kamala Harris knew this was going to be a coin flip. I think she spoke very gracefully, graciously. It was a nice speech. It wasn't too long, which is nice because we're all very tired by 5 o'clock yesterday. And it was good on her to concede and call Donald Trump. Obviously, I make no excuses for the way he behaved when he lost last time. That was awful. So good on her for conceding gracefully and saying that there should be a transfer of power, and that was the right thing to do.
Yeah, and I think that's right, and fair play to you for saying so. The issue here, I think, before we get into the politics of it, on just a human level, if you lose a presidential election, that's typically the defining event of your life, right? When the obituary is written, that's the first paragraph. Normally, unless you do the very rare thing that Trump did, which is lose one and then come back.
Very rare thing in that we have to go back to Grover Cleveland.
Good old Grover.
Sequentially.
Not a good day for Grover in the history books because he is now less.
I'm actually a big Grover Cleveland fan. We won't get into that today, but I rather like his politics.
New radar, pro Grover Cleveland radar, maybe. So look, on that human level, I thought she did a good job. I thought it was a perfectly fine point to make to say that she concedes the election, but she doesn't concede the facts. Sure. Half a century ago, Ted Kennedy lost a primary to Jimmy Carter and talked about this speech, "The dream will never die," and talking about keeping true to one's values. I thought all that was fair enough, and I think it was right that Kamala Harris did emphasize the bedrock importance to democracy of acknowledging defeat if you're defeated, which Donald Trump did not do last time around.
Right. And obviously the pundit class, very upset. I do think, unfortunately, I do not think it's the case that, she ran a perfect campaign and there was just no way. It might be the case that even a perfect campaign was not going to win given the margin of Trump's victory. But as I said yesterday in my radar, I don't think you can say it was a perfect campaign or that she was a perfect candidate, given that she just failed to distance herself from the administration she was part of. I think it was a difficult task. I'm not saying she had an easy task and screwed it up. It was a very, very difficult task, but I don't think they did absolutely everything they could have to win. I think she needed to distance herself from the administration, in some ways moving to the right, in some ways moving to the left, but just moving in any way and not being proximate to Joe Biden. That was always going to be tough, but they could have done it more effectively.
No, they could have, and we were talking at other points in today's show about the idea of, she could have done more in unorthodox or independent media strands, things like that, given voters more of a sense of who she was. She was facing very hard and very heavy headwinds, Joe Biden, with low approval numbers, particularly low approval numbers on the economy, which in peacetime it tends to be the central issue, and I think was.
Yeah, and in an era where all over the world incumbents are losing, and it's not even if the incumbent is conservative, as it was in Britain, the Conservative Party being tossed out after a really long, formidable time in power, actually a stunning time in power by American standards, where we now live through an era where we often change our party not just every 8 years, but every 4 years. A remarkable amount of continuity for the Tories in England, them finally losing. So this is happening all over Europe, or all over places where you actually do get to vote on your leader. It's not happening in China and Russia because they don't have the power to do that. Right. But in places where we actually do decide things democratically, incumbents were going down. There's tremendous frustration in a populist direction, not necessarily in a cleanly ideologically right-left direction, about the way things are headed and about about immigration, and that manifests in different ways. But they're going to have to see how to grapple with that.
Yes, absolutely. And just before we wrap this up, I want to say briefly a word in defense of Jimmy Kimmel. I'm often critical, as we both are, of late night hosts and all that. Look, Kamala Harris lost by a sizable margin, but around about 66 million people voted for her. And a lot of those people think, in Trump's case, January the 6th should be disqualifying. And a lot of them are sincerely worried about the effects of a second Trump presidency on vulnerable people, on American freedoms, on the independence of the legal system from the political system, and so on and so forth. The clip that we just played from Kimmel, I think, was a sincere expression of his distress about that, and I have no problem with that.
Yeah, we'll find out. You know, I was thinking, this occurred to me yesterday again because I was probably so overtired to the point of near insanity. We could have back-to-back Grover Cleveland non-sequential presidents if Joe Biden seeks the presidency again.
At the age of 86.
You know, he's the only one who actually beat Trump. Say what you will.
He's done twice. He's done what two other nominees have failed to do.
Joe Biden, 2028. I don't know. We'll see about that. Lots more to get into today, including an interview with Abraham Enriquez, a conservative strategist, about how Trump successfully courted Latino male voters. Stick around. Latino voters took a big right turn toward Donald Trump in this week's presidential election. Now, while Vice President Kamala Harris did finish with a slim majority of support from the Hispanic community at 53%, Trump got 45% of that vote. That's a 13-point increase from his 2020 total and a record high number for a Republican presidential nominee, according to NBC exit polls. Exit polls can always be revised later, but that's what we know so far. Trump's numbers beat the previous record for Republican candidate set by George W. Bush at 44% in 2004. Harris underperformed Biden with Hispanic voters by 12 points.
Up until the election's final days, Latino voters repeatedly named the economy as their number one issue and gave Trump the advantage on that topic. So here to talk about what happened, where the Democrats went wrong, where President-elect Donald Trump went right, is founder and president of Bienvenido US, Abraham Enriquez. Abraham, welcome.
Good morning, thank you.
So let's start off with this big picture, because really it was one of the most dramatic elements within these election results, just how much Latino voters appeared to shift toward now President-elect Trump. Have to get used to calling him President-elect rather than former President Trump. What do you ascribe that shift to in terms of the big currents that are at work here?
Yeah, Neil, great to be with you. Look, at this presidential election cycle, our organization, we dedicated a team and resources in 5 battleground states in some of the most Hispanic populated counties, doing town halls, knocking on doors, calling voters. We realized that the Hispanic community wanted to return back to an economy that worked for them, wanted to return to an economy that didn't see gas prices and groceries prices skyrocketed. And so when they asked the question of what candidate's going to make my life better, President Trump broke down policy in a way that the everyday Hispanic could understand it. Whereas in Kamala Harris, she had a difficult time divorcing herself from an administration that was widely unpopular with Hispanics. And then when asked what she was going to do with the economy, she reverted back to, we're going to give you abortion and climate change policies, so feel the joy and embrace Latinx. So where did they go wrong? Well, they didn't understand that 2/3 of Hispanics on the voter rolls are now second and third generation Americans, meaning we're assimilating to American culture better and want to be spoken to and talked to just like everyday Americans. And obviously hitting the campaign trail, we see President Trump really doing a better job at resonating with Hispanic voters.
Is it resonating with the Republican Party that they're doing so much better with this demographic, with minority voters? Because, as you know, there's been a lot of fear for years and years and years about the impact in the Republican Party, about the impact immigration would have on the changing landscape of the party's fortunes, and an assumption that Republicans and Democrats shared that bringing in more people would hurt the Republican Party's chances because they would reliably vote Democrat. I've been saying for years that I didn't think that was true from looking at the actual views of so many immigrants coming in who actually have more conservative views on a variety of subjects than the native-born population. And I've been arguing about this with Republicans for years and years and years. I feel like I was right, and I'm being proved that I was right, but are they getting that message, or am I wrong?
No, I think the Republican Party, instead of all that money that they invested on consultants trying to diagnose the Hispanic vote, they should have just listened to you for free, Robby, and they would have saved themselves a lot of trouble. But look, I'm very cautious of saying that because President Trump did so well with the Hispanic vote, this now means that millions of Hispanics are now embracing the Republican Party, when I think that this is such a unique election. And you look at how President Trump did specifically well with young Latino men. I think before we get ahead of ourselves and say that Hispanics are embracing the Republican Party, it's better to say Hispanics are embracing President Trump. Now, will the party start aligning themselves more with the values that President Trump and the vision that President Trump is casting is the real question. You look at in the midterms in 2022, Republicans had a really hard time, but when President Trump's on the ballot, we know that he ushers in new voters. So I'm excited to see how the party is going to start molding itself to give the big bienvenido to these new Hispanic voters. And quite honestly, Robby, I'm going to be quite frank with you. This idea that Republicans were clutching their pearls at the thought of all these Hispanics joining the party because it was going to fundamentally change the party. Well, I'm happy we're changing the party because here's the truth. Hispanics were conservative before Republicans were conservative. So the way I see it is, if the survival of the Republican Party needs to exist, then for the grace of God, we need more Hispanics in the party, because only then will the party start tracking more conservative.
Abraham, let me give you a couple of liberal arguments that are made about the Latino vote, so you at least have a chance to respond to them, because one certainly hears from the conservative or the pro-Trump side about the economic argument. But if you listen to liberals, or supporters for that matter, of Vice President Harris talk about this shift, they tend to talk about two things. One is this idea that because in terms of the culture of politics in Latin America, that Latino voters have some sort of fondness for strongman type leaders. And the second point that people make is that there was a particularly pronounced shift among Latino men, seemingly much more so than Latino women, and that speaks to frankly, sexism. What's your response to those arguments?
Yeah, look, I think we need to separate that. We need to kind of dive into that conversation in two separate parts. One, this idea that Hispanics, and I want to focus on Mexican men for an example, just because Mexicans are more than 60% of the Hispanic voting bloc, making us a super majority. You look at Mexico, they just elected their first woman president. So this idea that Mexican men or Hispanic men can't get behind a woman, I think is completely false. You also look at, deep counties. Let's look at Hidalgo County, almost 90% Hispanic. Voted Monica La Cruz, a Hispanic woman, for Congress. You look at Miami-Dade County, Maria Elvira Salazar. You look at New York City, or New York with Nicole Maliotakis. These are Hispanic women who are gaining support from Hispanic men. So this idea that men have an issue with women leading, well, there's so many examples of how that's incorrect. But more specifically, I think that the Democrat Party for the past 4 years have waged war on this idea that if you're a man and you want to be a provider of your home and you don't want men and women's sports, and you're immediately labeled as a toxic, masculine man. And that's waging war on just Hispanic values within itself. But when you talk to young Hispanic men across the nation, and they see that President Trump was outcasted, they see that at every turn he was, he was put into battle. I think a lot of Hispanic men saw themselves in that, that they're in American culture, we do have to fight for a lot of the things that we want. It's good. We want a healthy competition, but they saw themselves in that. Whereas in Kamala Harris, she ran her campaign on how Trump is a threat to democracy, and you're not respecting the democratic process of even going through a primary. So how do you expect Hispanic men to who care about democracy, who care about making sure the United States doesn't turn into Venezuela and Cuba, get behind a candidate who just completely blinded themselves to what democracy really is? I think that really is the answer here.
Abraham Enriquez, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you both.
In the category of winners and losers from Trump 2.0, Ukraine decidedly falls into the latter category. The Biden administration says it will rush the last $6 billion earmarked to Ukraine before the inauguration. The lame duck president can give Ukraine $4.3 billion worth of Pentagon weapons that are ready to go, and has $2.1 billion on hand to put in more orders for weapons with US defense contractors.
It often takes months for American weapons to make it to Ukraine's front lines, and Trump might be able to halt the shipments before they get to the battlefield. as that could be the last aid the nation sees from the U.S. for a while. President-elect Donald Trump has not hidden his disdain for how this war is being conducted, or his respect, perhaps, for the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Joining us now to weigh in is host of the Daniel Davis Deep Dive on YouTube, Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis. Great to have you back.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
So do you expect we might actually see a change in foreign policy with respect to Ukraine? This is something that many Republican voters and some Republican politicians have talked about. J.D. Vance has talked about, the vice president-elect, charting a different course, playing some role in persuading Ukraine and Russia to make peace, even if that comes with Ukraine having to do some concessions. And Donald Trump has, I think, gestured at that idea as well, and obviously has a warmer relationship with Vladimir Putin, or a relationship that many in the mainstream media have criticized. What do you actually expect to see from the new administration on this particular front?
Well, I mean, first of all, you have to look at Trump directly campaigned on that he would, quote, end the war in a day. So obviously that's a hyperbole. Nothing could be done in a day. But his claims were repeated when he met with Zelensky in September, in the latter days of the campaign, where he said, standing right next to Zelensky, that he wanted to have a negotiated settlement. He wants this thing to be done. He wants to get Zelensky and Putin together and have a conversation. And there's no reason to think there's anything different today. I actually was on the phone earlier this morning with the senior Trump advisor on foreign policy, and they confirmed to me that is still very much his position. I was told that, quote, that Trump believes that, quote, war is a stalemate, and he said it cannot be won by military means. He said it doesn't matter how much weapons and ammunition the United States give, the war is simply unwinnable. A view that I absolutely echo and have been saying on your network for a couple of years, that it's just not winnable. So I think that Trump recognizes that and acknowledges the simple truth. And so it would be foolish, if not actually harmful to the Ukrainian people, to say we're just going to blithely go on and just keep doing what the previous administration has done, because that will harm Ukraine ultimately. And this is something that I don't hear enough of in the Western media. If you look at this from a military perspective, it's not a stalemate. And the Washington Post and the U.S. Intelligence community have recently admitted this. Russia is succeeding on the battlefield. And if things continue on in the way that they've been going, Russia will eventually win a military victory. And that would be far, far worse for Ukrainian outcome, and definitely for American and Western Europe if that event came to it. So it makes a lot of sense to try to get this thing negotiated in the best terms possible as fast as possible.
But if President-elect Trump is sending the signal that he will, at the very least, reduce aid to Ukraine, and if, in your account, Vladimir Putin and the Russians are succeeding or have the upper hand on the battlefield, doesn't that actually, withdrawing or reducing aid, actually embolden Putin further to continue with the invasion with the hope of winning a total or near total victory?
Now, if you listen to what the Russians have been saying and are still saying, and what they're doing on the battlefield, they don't care who won the American presidential election. They're going through with the assumption that they're not going to get a negotiated settlement because they claim they don't trust the West. Agreements have been reached in the past and met, so they are moving forward to settle this issue on the battlefield. If Trump can provide a viable diplomatic alternative that can help them get their objective, which is security on their border, without having to continue to lose all of the men that they would have to win militarily, then it's they have an incentive and a motivation to have a negotiated settlement. But listen, here's the hard part, is that it's not at all clear that the current lines of contact are where the negotiation would be. Putin has indicated that he wants more than where he is now. So I'm not even saying that if Trump goes in and does this, that the conflict will be frozen on its current lines and that will be negotiated. Putin may say, no, I want more than that, even in a negotiation, and then Trump and the West and everybody else is going to have to decide, are they willing to settle for less than they have now, or do they ignore that and then have the risk that Russia conquers more territory? So this is going to be a very
conquers more and then says, now in the negotiation we want even more, right?
Well, I mean, that is the truth, and the harsh reality that we have been unwilling to come to grips with is that they have the upper hand militarily and can do that no matter what we want to happen. The only way that that could change is if we directly engaged with U.S. troops or NATO troops, and of course, that would be the most catastrophic outcome because now then you have the prospect, if not probability, of escalating into nuclear war. We just don't have any good plays here. That's the reality.
So one of the themes that emerged during the campaign was the level of disrespect that some current and former military minds have for Donald Trump. Obviously, during his previous term, there was when he ran, he talked a very different kind of foreign policy. And in some ways, the foreign policy was different, but in some ways, there is just continuity in the subject because there's a bunch of experts and military officials who remain in charge regardless of the partisan shape of the administration. Now that that's all kind of in the open, the level of disrespect some of them have for Trump, is he going to be able to I don't know, keep his eye on the prize and actually chart a different foreign policy with so many of the same people still behind the scenes in charge?
Well, I mean, we certainly have to hope so. I mean, he has been elected by the American people as the commander-in-chief. So it is incumbent upon him, and frankly, one of his shortcomings in his first administration, that he did not take that role seriously enough internally. And that means that you've got to find folks that are willing to do their constitutional job and to obey the orders of the President of the United States. That's actually in our oath of office as officers. And if people aren't willing to do that, and if they're trying to subvert it, then I'll bluntly stated, they need to be replaced. Because we're supposed to have our oath to the Constitution, not to anybody, man or woman, who's elected to the office. And I think that is a dangerous situation and an unhealthy one if you have members of the military or people in government that are trying to subvert or not do what the president wants. If you don't agree with it, you have every right to withdraw and to resign from your position. And I think that that's the honorable thing to do if you don't think that you can put their vision into place. But I assure you, there are quite a number of military experts who very much agree with Trump's positions on foreign policy and would be happy to step into those roles should these others want to vacate them.
And just briefly, you say that there are a lot of those people there, but what is your level of confidence that it is the people who will follow through on the preferred Trump policy who will get those jobs versus people who would want to block those policies?
I think that because Trump had such a problem with that in the first administration and didn't figure it out until literally the last maybe even a third of a year of his term, I know for sure because I've talked to some of the folks on his transition team, and they're very painfully aware of that, and they're doing very good work as much as they can to try to identify people who do want to, who do share the president's vision and want to go into these positions. But I think it kind of implied in your comment there is that there are a great many people in the government and in the military, and you can't go through and just call all them out in the next 60 days or so. So you're going to have to do the best you can to govern with what you have. But all of that with the caveat that he remains, or will be rather, the commander-in-chief, and it is required. Any commander, if even a military unit, has to say, hey, if you're not willing to obey the orders that I give, then you got to go somewhere else. And it remains to be seen whether Trump will push back and do that or not. But if he doesn't, I think he's going to have a harder time seeing his vision brought to reality.
I promise we'll let you go after this, but do you have thoughts on the Israel situation that really did end up hurting Kamala Harris, I think, during this campaign in places like Michigan, her proximity to Joe Biden's position? Trump has been not as clear on this subject as I think he was on Ukraine, if it's going to be a similar level. I mean, he's full-throatedly supported Netanyahu in Israel in the past, but he got Muslim Arab American votes from people who want the violence there to end. I think it remains to be seen exactly what's going to happen or if it's going to be any different from the current administration, but there really is a hunger among some of the voters Trump got this time to pull back, wind down, or at least not be actively aiding the violence in Gaza.
Right. Yeah, I think that that's one of the bigger results from this, because you saw it during the primary season, where a lot of these voters, especially in Michigan and Minnesota, gave their protest vote, so to speak. But it wasn't listened to. They didn't listen to it enough, and then it turned into a real issue, especially in like Dearborn. That's shocking results, I think. And the issue now is that Trump doesn't have to worry about an election, so he didn't have to worry about, frankly, making anyone happy or not. He's just got to do what he thinks is the best. But I think that you can see that there in Trump's, I guess, his DNA, or what he's been really from the beginning all the way through his last administration and now, is that he is fundamentally against escalation into war. He does not want to go into a war, especially one that can't be won, and he has correctly recognized the Ukraine war can't be won. And I hope that and the people he puts in place recognize that the war that Israel has gotten itself on, this 7-front war by their own accounting, can't be militarily won. And so I doubt that he's going to come in and just say, all right, whatever you say, Netanyahu, just here's a bunch more bombs and stuff, because that won't help the Israeli state. They won't be able to succeed with that. And so I suspect, but I don't have any confidence, because I haven't heard from anybody on the campaign right now about what he plans specifically to do with that. But that's just what he's done in the past.
Doing that would not be good for Israel's security or for U.S. security, frankly. So I hope we listen to some points of restraint on multiple subjects. Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, thank you so much for joining us today.
Always my pleasure. Thank you.
Democrats are not the only ones licking their wounds and trying to figure out how things could have gone so wrong. The mainstream media itself is worried that they're losing their total grip on power and on control of the narrative.
This year's crop of media luminaries include Joe Rogan, Charlemagne the God, and social media influencers. Here with us now to discuss what is next for media is Steve Krakauer, author of Uncovered: How the Media Got Cozy with Power. Thanks for joining us, Steve.
Hey, great to be here.
So just let's start off at the top. What are your takeaways, so to speak, from this campaign and the media's role within it?
Yeah, I completely agree with how you set it up. I think that we see a few things happening, and obviously when you have an election like this, any election, but particularly one that is this decisive, there's going to be, the think pieces are going to be flowing. So I will say, there's not one diagnosis, but a few things stand out to me. First of all, I think, let me do it to the social media side. Social media and in relation to how it goes with new media, because we saw a few things happening. Yes, we saw Taylor Swift, for example, endorse Kamala Harris in an Instagram post. Never really speak out about it. And you think, there's no way for us to look at exit polls of where the Swiftie vote broke down, but I am curious to know if that actually moves the needle, because I'm not sure it does. Where, especially when you contrast that with something like Joe Rogan, who does these 3-hour-long interviews with Donald Trump, then J.D. Vance, then Elon Musk, even before he then, on a late night, on a Monday night before the election, endorsed Trump, just giving a real sense of substance, real nuance, conversation, that, it seems at least, to move the needle much more than just a random post on Instagram and just a social media influencer doing something. Even like Aiden Ross, who was actually given a shout out by Dana White in that Trump victory speech. This is a streamer, appeals to Gen Z, particularly young males. That wasn't just an endorsement in a post on social media, but an hour-long live stream that you got to see Donald Trump in a different way. So I think the idea of substance in this election, rather than just general influence, what used to be a kind of a cachet of like, okay, this person is we're going to just go along with what this person posts on any platform, Instagram, TikTok, wherever. That seemed to move the needle much more than just like a one-off post here. So I think that is definitely an interesting element of this election.
Yeah, you're sort of referencing a really interesting X thread I saw yesterday from a Time reporter about how the Trump podcasting schedule came to be, how this young staff member of the Trump campaign got in touch and said, these are the list of podcasts I want you to do. And Trump actually said, talk to my son Barron about it. I don't know any of these people. And so Barron helped plan that. He's not very involved overall in the campaign, but helped plan the appearance with Aiden Ross, ultimately Joe Rogan, and everyone they went on in between. I think you're so right. And this is a different kind of interview that takes place on these podcasts. And the mainstream media people often are very dismissive of these podcasts for not having the same level of adversarial questioning. You know, when you do from the traditional media, when you do an interview with a political figure, you're supposed to be scoop-driven. You're supposed to be news-making driven. You're supposed to ask them something new that's going to prompt them to answer a question in a different way where it generates its own headline. You know, Joe Biden said this for the first time. That's the mindset of, you know, those of us who've worked in traditional media. But that's not what these podcasts are. Sometimes 3 hours long conversations where you just get to feel like you know the person better, and that is there's a massive new audience for that kind of thing that I don't think the mainstream understands.
Totally, yeah. I mean, a few things there. First of all, the idea that this Time magazine piece, really fascinating. And as you point out, Barron Trump, 18-year-old Barron Trump, led this strategy of where his dad should go and appear. And it began with Adin Ross and then continued through places like Theo Von, through the Nelk Boys, through Andrew Schultz, and then ultimately Joe Rogan. And the idea was appeal to young males in particular, but really people who are political independents, not very political at all, but have anything that they think about when it comes to politics comes through the side door, comes through culture. And you look at those interviews and you're absolutely right. Yeah, Andrew Schultz, for example, was not trying to make news. He's a comedian, very popular podcast, sat down with Donald Trump in a very funny interview that showed a totally different side of him. But he made news because he got Donald Trump to reveal for the first time. And then ultimately this has become like a thing that Trump talks about in rallies, the weave. We learned about the way that Trump thinks about how he does answers questions, for example, or talks during a rally is you start at a place and then you do your weave and you come back to it. It's become like this iconic, phrase that he said, but he never had actually revealed that before this Andrew Schultz interview. So you end up breaking news anyway. And you contrast that with Kamala Harris. Think about this. I saw another interview that was happening and someone said, what the left needs is their own Joe Rogan. And someone said, no, they had their own Joe Rogan. His name was Joe Rogan. He voted for Bernie Sanders 4 years ago. Like, you've lost Joe Rogan. And Joe Rogan was ready to do an interview with Kamala Harris, have her come down to Austin, 3 hours, sit down, have a conversation. He calls these conversations, not interviews. And it could have been a great opportunity. And it certainly could have invalidated the Trump side of it. Trump does 3 hours, Kamala does 3 hours, everyone moves on, but she can't do it. She refused to do it. Her campaign wanted him to go and fly to her, and it would only be 1 hour. And he's like, no, this is an opportunity for you to come and do this. Speak to millions and millions of people who come at politics in a different way. And she either refused to do it or she couldn't do it, because the truth is that, as we learned, Kamala Harris does not have that in her arsenal to have a conversation. Free-flowing, casual for 3 hours. That's not something that she has in her skill set. And this is an election where that mattered. People want that authenticity, and you got that in the strategy that Trump employed.
Let me take the other side of this argument to some extent, Steve, in terms of the issue of the sort of long podcast conversational style versus the traditional, let's say, 60 minutes style of interview. I do take the point about authenticity. I do take the point that it isn't always the best thing for anyone to try to boil down very complicated political interviews into 3 minutes or to be constantly looking for a soundbite. But whenever we have people seeking the highest office in the nation, seeking to be commander-in-chief, and they're having these kind of bro chats, or whatever the equivalent would be on the female side with Kamala Harris, is there not a danger that we just lose any sense of people seeking the presidency being rightfully held accountable by media questioners?
I think you're right. Yeah. And I am of the camp that Donald Trump should have done the 60 minutes interview. Traditionally, both candidates do 60 minutes, and it became like the Rogan. Both candidates do the Rogan interview. I think Donald Trump should have taken up 60 minutes on their offer to do the interview. It would have been adversarial. It would have been a tough back and forth, but he can do that. We've seen him do that just fine. And I think he should have done that. And frankly, I think that Kamala Harris sitting down and doing it did not help her a lot either. There were some moments in there that she really flailed. I think that Trump could have taken that, and he should have. And I am a big supporter of the kind of playing the both ends of the spectrum here. I think 60 Minutes appeals to a totally different demographic. It's older, but it's a valuable voting group that you want as well. And so I think that Trump did some. J.D. Vance was really deployed on that front to do those kind of the mainstream interviews on every network. I mean, he was ubiquitous on corporate, traditional media, as he should be, There should be a representative of the campaign on that front. But I have to say, you know, when I look at like what was the legacy media's legacy of this election, I think about unity. I think about their talking point that Liz Cheney represented unity on the Democratic side. That was the country over party. That was obviously pushed from the Kamala Harris campaign, but also from the media themselves. And you think about that's what they think of unity, this person who has no appeal to the right and frankly no appeal to the left. When you have on the other side a story that was completely ignored that I think will become a years-long conversation, Elon Musk, a guy who was on the left, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., a Democrat, Tulsi Gabbard, who was high up in the Democratic Party, who are going and endorsing Trump. I think the average person, the average voter, sees that as unity and sees the mainstream media ignoring that unity in favor of Liz Cheney and Kamala Harris as another sign of why their trust is being eroded.
Very quickly before we let you go, when Trump won in 2016, as unhappy as members of the media were about it, it was good for business, the Trump resistance being good for views and shares and clicks, etc., ended up being a gift to mainstream media's business models, fundamentals for a few years at least. That's collapsed again. Biden is just a more boring figure to cover from a media perspective. Do you predict the media is going to have, the mainstream legacy institutions are going to have another resurgence now that Trump is back? Or is there just so much fatigue or frankly so much subscription canceling from angry libs, whoever they had left, that it's not going to matter this time around?
No, I don't see the resurgence at all. I think that the Trump next administration is going to be seen differently. I think that there's more of a mandate, frankly, that we saw. You can't say that he just squeaked this one by. I mean, this was a full-scale just landslide that he won by. And I think that what we've seen is that for 4 years, and you could make an argument for 8 years, the media has portrayed a narrative about Donald Trump and frankly about Trump supporters that this election proved they are completely wrong. And I don't want to say they're wrong, but just that there is a rejection by the public across broad swaths of the electorate that say, we don't subscribe to that. So sure, there will be a, hashtag resistance that the corporate media can appeal to. But I think that they have seen that it's not real, it's not big, and people rejected that. And so I don't think that that can be part of the business model this time. I think that if it is, it will be just another failure of frankly, of curiosity, of journalism, but also from a business perspective, it's not going to work this time.
Steve Krakauer, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Absolutely, anytime.
President Joe Biden addressed the nation this morning. He tried to rally Americans who had wanted his vice president to take the reins. Let's watch.
Setbacks are unavoidable, but giving up is unforgivable. Setbacks are unavoidable, but giving up is unforgivable. We all get knocked down, but the measure of our character, as my dad would say, is how quickly we get back up. Remember, a defeat does not mean we are defeated. We lost this battle. The America of your dreams is calling for you to get back up.
And he then went on to say, a democracy deserves respect even when you do not agree.
And we're in a democracy. The will of the people always prevails. Yesterday, I spoke with President-elect Trump to congratulate him on his victory. And I assured him that I'd direct my entire administration to work with his team to ensure a peaceful and orderly transition. That's what the American people deserve.
And finally, he defended America and the process of voting.
I also hope we can lay to rest the question about the integrity of the American electoral system. It is honest, it is fair, and it is transparent. And it can be trusted, win or lose. I also hope we can restore the respect for all our election workers who busted their necks and took risks at the outset. We should thank them. Thank them for staffing voting sites, counting the votes, protecting the very integrity of the election. Many of them are volunteers who do it simply out of love for their country. And as they did their duty as citizens.
Over there, Robby. What do you make of that?
I mean, yeah, good for him, just like Kamala Harris conceding gracefully and promising an orderly transition. That is a good thing. It was a bad thing when Trump did not behave that way. And so, glad to hear it. And yes, I share the admiration for our system and for our poll workers and for everyone who makes democracy possible. I wish all the voting took place same day everywhere as it does in every other country. I'm not sure what the barriers are to that taking place. They're probably different in the different states. Like, we're still going to be getting Arizona results, I think, for days to come. The total, the number of votes that both people had is going to still be going. Oh, that's projected right now. What, 72 million votes for Donald Trump, 67 million for Kamala Harris. That, I believe, that is pretty close to Trump's total from last time. Yeah, Trump's total last time was 74 million, but Biden got 81 million. So I have already seen some kind of the anti-Trump resistance Twitter account, Blue Anon, I call them, people being like, where are those other 15 million votes? What happened to those votes? They made them disappear. And I've actually seen, and I'm just going to say this, I do not co-sign this view whatsoever.
Oh, no.
I do not think 2020 was stolen, but I have seen some conservative people being like, was it actually stolen if we won this easily this time?
Well, I mean, hopefully they are thinking back and realizing that the claims about 2020 being stolen were fraudulent.
I agree that they were fraudulent.
Fair credit to President Biden for standing up and saying that, peaceful transition and that this should encourage confidence in election systems. The thing that always frustrated me about 2020 was there was nothing surprising about the result. It was broadly in line with polls. Trump outperformed his polls, in fact, in 2020.
He dramatically outperformed his polls. He outperformed them more than he did in either of these two elections. That's what's funny about this election.
Right.
He's outperformed the polls. The polls were exactly even. They had a 50-50 election, and it's a Trump plus 2.5, 3 election. Last time, it was supposed to be a Biden plus 6 election. It was a Biden plus 1 election.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And this is now a consistent trend across all 3 elections that Trump has outperformed his numbers to some degree. The thing that I had many objections to the protests that ensued after 2020, but one of them was that
it was not great.
It wasn't. The result was completely predictable and in line with what you would expect with an incumbent president whose performance on a very contentious issue, COVID, was quite unpopular.
Right, and who was just the president during the most terrible thing that had happened to the country in decades and decades and decades, was going to perhaps get punished independent of what they did or their policies. I mean, Trump didn't know how to respond to it. He careened wildly from I'm going to just trust the health advisors to take care of this, to I'm frustrated with the economy being shut down and I want to undo all this, to being like, well, no, I am going to listen to that. He didn't know. He didn't understand what his base and what his supporters actually wanted out of him for a while. I think eventually he figured it out. It was too late by then.
And do you think, Biden there making it very clear that this should restore faith in election integrity. Do you think it will? Now that Trump has won again, do you think that those election deniers, or whatever you want to term them, on the MAGA right will fade away to any extent? Will that idea fade away, or will they be waiting for the midterms or the next presidential election to resurrect those sort of fictitious claims?
I hope so. We can't tell until, Trump's not going to be running for president again, I don't think, unless there's some fundamental change to our constitutional order.
I guess those people would come back if it was Vance, for example.
No, I don't know. I think they very well could. I'm glad to see so far that at no high level is any kind of election delegitimization stuff coming out of the Democratic camp either. Not to say there was an equivalence, but Hillary Clinton's level of complaining when she lost did at some point rise to the level. Again, she didn't take any action, but rhetorically saying it was illegitimate because of the Russian interference or influence. There were people, when John Kerry lost, even John Kerry humored it a little bit, I forget what state it was, saying
Ohio,
the irregularities in Ohio. We're not seeing anything even close to even approach. I'm not seeing anything at all, except from some no account Twitter type people, and I think that's very good.
Yeah, and the fact that Trump won by such
it's just not close enough.
It's not close enough. It's like it couldn't be that. There's no plausible claim you can make. She got beaten, and that was that.
Yeah, I mean, Biden won in the popular vote by a massive number, by millions and millions of votes, but it was extremely close. It was just, I think, 60, 70,000 votes, or maybe might have been 120,000. I think it was 60, 70,000 votes was the margin of Trump's victory versus Hillary in the 3 states cumulatively. It might have been twice as much as that for Biden. This is Trump winning the popular vote by less than Biden won it, but in the key swing states winning by even more than that margin, I think. I think it's 120,000 in just Pennsylvania, so we'll have to see.
We will. We shall have to see how that goes.
Quite a victory. But nice to see Joe Biden for one of the probably last times we're going to be...
He'll be back. He says he wants to make every one of, I think he said 74 days or something left. He wants to make every day count. So you'll see plenty more from Robby. Take faith. Have heart.
Our president working hard for you, for us, for the American people. More rising still to come. Please stay around. If you spend any time on X or on Substack reading the most thought-provoking essays from conservatives, you've probably encountered Richard Hanania. Richard is the author of the book, The Origins of Woke, which explains how civil rights law created the conditions for woke progressives to engage in ideological enforcement in schools and in the workplace. He is extremely critical of woke progressives, and during the pandemic he strongly denounced COVID overreaches like mask mandates and school closures. But Richard also has a lot of strident criticisms for conservatives. He writes that on average right-wing people are not as well informed as left-wing people, and has also authored a recent newsletter piece that I thought this audience would like to hear about. It's titled Why Americans Should Die for Ukraine, challenging prevailing wisdom on the right about the importance of U.S. involvement in that conflict. Richard Hanania joins me now to discuss that and much more, the election, politics, etc. Richard, I read a lot of what you write, and I find myself nodding along in agreement, sometimes vigorous agreement with like most of it, and then I'll read something that I totally disagree with, or even something that like offends me on a visceral level. That's probably a good trait for an intellectual, that I don't just like automatically agree with what you say, or I think it's worth reading even when I don't appreciate it. But you would, I think, concede that you have been lumped under a variety of ideological categories on the right broadly over the last few years. I think I knew you first as a kind of Iraq War critic, non-interventionist. I think that's what you were on Rising the first time to talk about. And then we were like very in sync on COVID stuff. But you're now more of like a liberal internationalist foreign policy person, but you're also libertarian on a lot of regulatory issues. So why don't you describe yourself for viewers who are thinking right now, who is this person and this doesn't make any sense?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on, Robby. I am, I'm an independent writer, so I have the luxury of being able to say what I think and write what I want to write about and not be necessarily beholden to any line. And sometimes I can change my mind and I don't have to just explain it. Well, I explain it to my readers, but I don't have to, explain it to some ideological movement or donors or something like that. But basically, if you just want sort of the summary of my politics, I'm a classical libertarian. I used to be, the big substantive change in my politics over the last 3 years or so has been on foreign policy. I've become more sympathetic towards liberal internationalism, less sympathetic towards restraint or isolationism. I haven't gone the full, sort of resistance, MSNBC, State Department line. In some ways, I go beyond them on certain issues on foreign policy. I think Trump's Middle Eastern policy, the Abraham Accords, I think was a huge success. So in some ways, I'm to the right of the foreign policy establishment. In some ways, I'm with them. But other than that, I'm basically a libertarian, classical liberal who's critical of both sides.
So what are your takeaways from the election? We just had with Trump winning massively. I think most reasonable people expected it was going to be close and either was capable of winning, and that is the case, but Trump happened to win by a lot more than many people expected. Republicans winning all over the place on issues, on responses, on gut feelings that things are wrong with the economy and immigration and other such issues. Trump is going to have more of a free hand, I think, or he has fewer people in the Republican Party or in the prospective administration that are going to stop what he wants to do. We don't exactly know what he even wants to do on a variety of subjects, but he has, this time around, surrounded himself with a really unique set of ideological people, with former Democrats like RFK Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard, but then also Bill Ackman and Elon Musk. Will Elon Musk be the actual president of this country, with Trump just kind of operating as the front man or the spokesperson for the tech right agenda?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a couple ways of looking at this Trump victory, and it's quite remarkable. I mean, first of all, I think just we have to sort of, from a historical perspective and sort of from a perspective of historical causation, just acknowledge Trump's unique appeal. I was looking at the results that, the Mark Robinson scandal, and Mark Robinson lost by 10, 15 points because, of course he did. He had this scandal where he was on this pornographic website and talking about all kinds of weird things. Carrie Lake is another kind of person who, lost by a comfortable amount in Arizona. And these people, Trump has a lot of the flaws. I mean, he's an election denier like Carrie Lake. He says crazy things, including things that, arguably are bragging about sexually assaulting women, but it doesn't harm him. So I think there's just first of all, we have to have acknowledgement that this is a unique kind of historical figure with a unique appeal. And as for his victory, there's two ways to look at it. So the tech right, this is something that I wrote about last year. It was the emergence of these people in Silicon Valley. I was thinking about Mark Andreessen, lesser extent Elon Musk. I mean, he had bought Twitter at that point. He hadn't gone all in on Trump yet. So you have these influences. And these are generally pro-market, libertarianish people, but at the same time, you have these leftists like RFK and Tulsi Gabbard, and even Vance, who's sort of who is lumped in with the tech right, but also says a lot of stuff that's friendly to economic populism. So one of these sides, there's a kind of tension here. I think that probably I'm optimistic in the sense that I think the classical liberals, libertarians are probably going to get their way because that's where the GOP establishment is. I don't think RFK and Tulsi Gabbard are going to be as influential on policy as, say, Elon Musk or Peter Thiel or somebody like Peter Thiel is going to be. But it's going to be an interesting tension. It's going to be interesting to watch. And then, so that's the elite level. And then you could look at the level of sort of the mass public. And the story here is the Hispanic vote. I mean, it's a 25-point shift over one election cycle. Democrats went from winning 33 points, according to the NBC exit poll, to winning by 8 points this time. So 25-point shift in one election cycle, with the same candidate on the ballot. This is also sort of remarkable. I wrote an essay the other day about how this sort of discredits both the left and the right in their sort of demographic, determinism. We used to hear a lot about this during the days of the Obama coalition. They told us about the browning of America. This was something liberals, took seriously and were sort of optimistic about. Maybe Republicans could squeeze out one or two more elections, but then we're on a path to a permanent majority. And then Republicans started to believe it, and people like Tucker Carlson, like Ed Coulter, were saying, okay, we have to keep the country white because, as liberals tell us, it's going to be a less white country, so Republicans will never be able to win an election again. And as it turned out, Hispanics are basically, if you can shift people to 25 percentage points in one election cycle, you would be foolish to be making predictions 20, 30 years down the line, generationally. Also, Trump's success, the other part of the demographic momentum, was about the idea that young people in general were moving to the left. And we've seen, a shift in the other direction too. So I think that there's just it's a huge victory for Trump, for the Trump movement, and also a blow against this demographic determinism, which I think is unhealthy for both sides. It's unhealthy when the left sits there and say, we're going to become less white, therefore we're going to win. And it's unhealthy when conservatives sit there and say, we need to restrict immigration because we're getting replaced. So that's something that makes me optimistic.
We're going to talk a lot more about that coming up next. Stay with us. More Rising in just a minute. Bernie Sanders didn't hold back. He delivered a blistering reaction to the outcome of the presidential election, but he was not rebuking President-elect Donald Trump. Instead, he was going full scorched earth on the Democratic Party.
In a statement Sanders released Wednesday, the progressive senator from Vermont writes, quote, It should come as no great surprise that a Democratic Party which has abandoned working class people would find that the working class has abandoned them. While the Democratic leadership defends the status quo, the American people are angry and want change, and they're right. Sanders added, quote, "Will the big money interests and well-paid consultants who control the Democratic Party learn any real lessons from this disastrous campaign? Will they understand the pain and political alienation that tens of millions of Americans are experiencing? Do they have any ideas as to how we can take on the increasingly powerful oligarchy which has so much economic power?"
That is the question. Now, I was seeing pushback from Democrats, and you're probably better informed on this than I am. I really don't have a dog in this fight because while I don't like or agree with many of the policies of the Democratic Party, and I appreciate Bernie Sanders' honesty and that he is an ideological figure who believes in something and is not at all afraid to criticize his own side, I don't agree with his policies, and I don't think they'd be voters of the country, and I don't really want the Democratic Party for the most part to move in that direction, although I will admit I've become more concerned during COVID about the pharmaceutical industry and regulatory capture and all of those things. So I won't say there's nothing for me on the left in their approach to corporate power. I think corporate power can be dangerous, I'll admit that. But what I saw, the pushback from Democratic people to what Bernie Sanders said, they're saying, what are you talking about? Joe Biden was the most pro-labor president and it didn't get him anything, and almost saying, we tried with labor and they reject us anyway, so why should we even bother? But I don't really know who's right.
Well, I think Sanders is right, because I look at the exit polls from this election and it is clear that there is an ongoing sequence of events where working class voters are becoming increasingly Republican. And that should be a core Democratic constituency. Now, as I read Sanders' argument, it is that the Democratic Party has not been good enough at foregrounding those concerns about things like the minimum wage, about things like healthcare, about things that millions and millions of Americans are struggling with. And instead they take refuge in a kind of milquetoast approach sometimes, or in too much of a sort of fake centrism that doesn't actually win anyone over. So you take Liz Cheney around the country to no good effect at all, whereas if you give all those Americans who are disaffected for good reason, as Sanders sees it, who are struggling economically, some reason to vote for them, that is a good thing. I think there's a separate argument which Sanders would perhaps also make about how identity or identitarian politics has been a kind of dead end for the Democratic Party, because it often highlights or emphasizes differences between people of different ethnic or other backgrounds who share similar economic concerns.
The Harris campaign, they did, I guess, a little bit of outreach to the left in terms of having Tim Walz be the candidate who was one of the more left-leaning or more progressive on those issues, the economic issues, the labor issues, the people on the table. I think it was intended by her to be a kind of overture to the left. What I've learned from interacting with left pundits, people who've sat in your chair and who we've had on as guests, is that they're extremely principled and just kind of signaling, winking at them nicely is not enough. Right. You have to actually do things.
Right. Now, Harris did, much to Trump's chagrin, steal his idea about tip income becoming tax exempt. And that was clearly an attempt to appeal to working class voters. And frankly, it was an attempt to appeal to lots of people who work in the service industry in Nevada, which is where she made that speech where she announced that she was supporting that measure. It does not appear that that has worked. But I do think that in general, there is a propensity among the consultant class, as Sanders would put it, in the Democratic Party, to adopt this sort of Michael Bloomberg or Morning Joe version, which is liberal on social issues and conservative on fiscal issues, and that is actually quite a small proportion of the population who feel that way and are susceptible to voting for Democrats.
Yeah, I've run into that before because I actually used to describe myself that way in I mean, at some levels it still does fit me. I generally have, I am not a social conservative. I mean, what is now it's like I'm a moderate though, because I have some criticisms of what transgender activists tell me and those kinds of things, but I'm a moderate on abortion, I support gay marriage, etc. I'm not particularly religious, but I am economically conservative, although what economically conservative is now changing, because I'm for free trade and low tariffs, and that doesn't really describe either party right now.
No,
is
certainly not
something I'm sad about?
But it's diametrically opposed to the Trump position, which is a big issue.
Yeah, we're going to find out if he does that tariff for real and how it impacts. Now, he surrounded himself. It's interesting because the people advising Trump right now, or who have gotten into his inner circle, are a very unique assortment of intellectual characters who I'm sure we'll be talking about a lot in the coming weeks. We're going to see who's exercising influence over him, because if it's RFK Jr., this is someone who has a career of being, just setting aside whatever you might think of his views on a variety of subjects, someone who has fought corporations and the pharmaceutical industry and big business and environmental causes time and time again, fitting right into the progressive economic mold. Is that the person who's going to be influencing Trump? Or is it going to be, Bill Ackman and Elon Musk, who are very, very wealthy business people who, despite their, newfound support for the Republican Party and Trump and conservative causes, I have to imagine are going to say, please don't do this tariff, because that's going to be damaging to our businesses and our customers, etc. Who is going to be, and Trump has some ideological instincts, but also is very capable of changing his mind. The TikTok ban, he changed his mind totally on that. He changed his mind on other economic topics. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see whether he's genuinely going in a he used to be listening to someone like Steve Bannon, who has a lot of bad views and is despised by the left, but who actually had a much more of a pro-worker, pro-union, pro-labor instinct. He had no love for big business or free markets or anything of that kind. And he's not involved now. You have Elon Musk as like the prime intellectual and business interest. It's going to be really interesting to see. I think on that point about Trump, one of the interesting things is, yes, he's massively changeable in what he actually claims or purports to believe, but he does always have an eye on his own popularity. He does actually, for all that he's criticized on the left for many legitimate things, he also does have an instinct for what is popular and what isn't. And he has plainly won this election in part because of the issues that we're talking about, the ones that appeal to working class voters, that are able to expand his appeal despite all the things that Democrats cite as evidence of authoritarian tendencies or just offensiveness. He has been able to siphon off a certain amount of working class support that has got him over the line. So you would think, even though he has no elections further to run, that he would stay true to those beliefs so long as they continue to fuel his popularity. But he's a hard man to predict. He is a hard man to predict. But you're right that he, unlike many other Republicans, he does not want to implement policies that he thinks are going to damage his popularity or damage his influence and power within his increasingly large coalition of voters and supporters. That does it for us today on Rising. Thanks so much for tuning in. We really appreciate your support. Let us know what you think about the show in the comments and anywhere else. You can get a hold of me on Twitter, X, etc. And be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any of our content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we're now available anywhere you can find your podcasts. Bye-bye.